Time for the Revolutionary Spotlight with Saratoga 250 podcast. In the studio is Lauren Roberts, Saratoga County historian.
As the chair of the Saratoga County 250th American Revolution Commission, created by the Saratoga County Board of Supervisors in order to plan all of the events and commemorations for the upcoming 250th anniversary of America's War for Independence, with a focus on the battles of Saratoga. In honor of Women's History Month in March, we are going to be focusing on the roles that women played in the American Revolution, and particularly in the Northern Campaign of 1777. And today, Anne Clothier is going to be sharing the story of Elizabeth Munro Fisher, Anne, who has recently joined the Saratoga County Historian's Office after spending 13 years as the education director at Brookside Museum, also known as the Saratoga County History Center. Anne, would you mind just introducing yourself a little bit and letting us know how you got interested in women's roles in the Revolution?
Well, I'm very happy to be here today, sharing some information. I've been involved in the living history community as a reenactor since I was a teenager, and have had the opportunity to volunteer at a variety of local historic sites related to the American Revolution. Places like, of course, Saratoga Battlefield at the Saratoga National Historical Park, Johnson Hall State Historic Site, Fort Ticonderoga, and many other places like that. And by doing that volunteering and that reenacting, it gave me a chance to try out some of these daily activities and participate in the things that these women would have been doing on a daily basis, be it cooking, laundry, things like that, which helps to give a deeper understanding of their experiences 250 years ago.
I agree. I think, bringing history to life, actually immersing yourself in it, not only is it great for living historians who are looking to find out how these actual techniques took place, but certainly for visitors, it helps them to understand how things were done. And so today we're going to talk about Elizabeth Munro Fisher. She was a local resident who got caught up in the advancing armies and the conflict in the campaign of 1777, where Burgoyne was coming down from the north and made it to Saratoga before he was stopped by the American army and surrendered. So, Anne, can you tell us about the story of Elizabeth Munro Fisher?
Well, Elizabeth definitely has a fascinating story, and it's thanks to the fact that she wrote a memoir later in her life that we have a lot of this information. She later on ended up with some legal troubles, and in an attempt to try to vindicate herself, created this memoir that she published. And she includes some really amazing details about her early life, especially the fact that she was involved in the Burgoyne campaign, which came rolling through her neighborhood. Since she had loyalties to the crown due to her father's affiliation as well as her husband's, she was visited quite unpleasantly very early one morning by a corps of riflemen who surrounded her house.
Were the riflemen part of the British Army, or were they American?
They were the Americans. And so this is definitely a chance to flip the script of what we're often used to hearing about, seeing that there were people who have, again, very interesting stories, very compelling stories on the side of the Loyalists, or Royalists, as they're commonly known. Again, people who were loyal to the British Crown.
So what happened to Betsy Fisher on this morning?
She was awakened at 6 a.m. and she told them that her husband was not at home. They asked where he had gone, and she told them, and then they ordered her out of her house. She scooped up her infant child out of the cradle and went outside, and she sat down and she watched. They pulled everything out of the house and took her belongings and then set fire to her house. And she sat there and watched. There was little else she could do.
And so she's in Washington County, right? It's a pretty rural place. She's left in the middle of the woods. Her house has been burned down. She has a baby with her. I can't imagine what she was going through at that time. So what happened? What'd she decide to do?
She admits that she wasn't sure either. And eventually, a man came walking through, taking his cow toward the direction of the British camp so he could sell it. And she asked to be able to accompany him, and he allowed her to do so on the grounds that she could keep up. And so after that point, she walks, she estimates, about 22 miles. And she talks about how her shoes and her stockings were shredded. And again, remember, she is carrying a young infant this entire time for 22 miles. And she, in her memoir, admits that this was incredibly challenging, and she was really, really suffering throughout this journey.
You're listening to the Revolutionary Spotlight with Saratoga 250. And the podcast with us today is Saratoga County historian Lauren Roberts, as well as Anne Clothier, assistant to the Saratoga County historian.
Now, what happens to Elizabeth and her baby once they make it to the British lines?
So they do finally make it there. They are reunited with Mr. Fisher, her husband. Something that I find really fascinating in this memoir is that she says they were able to buy everything they needed in the camp. And we know that the armies had sutlers with them, which was a type of merchant who could sell necessary items. And usually we think of those items being food or spices.
Or spirits.
Or spirits, definitely. Tobacco, sewing needles, things like that. But this also implies that there was sources of clothing. Again, she had only the clothes on her back. And again, she had this young infant with her. So the fact that she was able to get everything she needed in Burgoyne's camp gives us an idea that this was a very, very happening place, that they had resources and lots of different things that could be acquired, certainly for a price. But since she and her husband were fairly affluent, apparently they were able to purchase these items.
So that's the situation when she first gets into the camp. But obviously, as the battles take place, as the British Army has less and less supplies after the second battle, when they get into the siege period, her situation in camp changes. And she has a pretty vivid memory, especially of one particular incident that's really sad.
Yes, she really tells us a lot about the deprivation that they were going through, about the dwindling food supplies and everything that was going on, and they were quite miserable. She talks about it being in the middle of October. They were suffering with cold and hunger. And she says, many a day I had nothing but a piece of raw salt pork, a biscuit, and a drink of water. She says, poor living for a nurse, meaning that she was still breastfeeding her infant. This child was about 11 months old, and so she was, again, having to care for this child. She was having to be essentially a refugee with the army. She is trying to figure out how to get some better food, and she sees an opportunity to gather supplies amongst the others and try to make some sort of soup with random supplies that they had mixed together. And she told them if they would go make up a fire back in the woods and get a large kettle hung on, we would fill it with provision and cook it, and it would last us some time. They consented to do it for a guinea, which is an impressive sum of money, which again shows us that the Fishers had financial resources. And they went to work and built up the fire, hung on the kettle and put the water in it, and then women put in what we pleased. We soon filled it with a variety. It began to boil. We all kept a distance from the fire for fear of the cannon that were placed on the other side. And again, that's the American Army with that cannon. And they soon discovered our fire and saluted us with a cannonball, struck and broke our kettle to pieces, and sent the provisions in the air. We met no hurt, only losing our intended feast. The soldiers demanded their pay, which I paid, but as the disappointment was so great, the rest declined paying anything, saying they'd lost enough by losing their provision. So for my folly, I had to pay for all.
It's a pretty incredible story, and it's great that we have her memoirs so we can learn about these, particular personal incidents. Of course, we know that the surrender happens on October 17th, 1777. Elizabeth Munro Fisher is part of the prisoners of war. The camp followers and, all of the combatants alike become prisoners of war. So what happens to her? Where does she go?
So for this woman with Burgoyne's army, since she was with the Loyalists, they were afforded an opportunity that was a little bit different from some of the others. They were allowed to head north and go to Canada. Instead, a lot of the others who were the camp followers with the British Army, they ended up having to march toward Boston. But again, Elizabeth was then again headed to Canada with her husband. She actually reunited with her father along the way. And again, we have to remember the time of year and the associated weather for that and the temperatures. So she is working her way northward along the Adirondacks in November of 1777. And so it was very cold and very stormy. She says, "We were 11 days on the lake in an open boat. It snowed and rained every day. We slept on shore every night on the ground, as there were no inhabitants on that side of the lake in those days, for they had fled on account of the war. On the 22nd day of November, we landed in Montreal." So again, to traverse that area in November as a refugee after having survived this campaign and the surrender is really an incredible feat.
Thanks for sharing her story. We are lucky that she wrote these memories down. And, part of the difficulty in finding women's stories is that they're not always written down. It's actually, a pretty small percentage. But if you look hard, you can find some of these individual stories. And it's worth the time and the research to be able to show and then share in interpretation through living history, through articles, and through podcasts like this to share these women's stories. So thanks so much for telling this story today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for giving the opportunity for Elizabeth's voice to be heard 250 years later.
Stay tuned for more great stories in the Saratoga 250 podcast at saratoga250.com.